Speaker today, Javier, is a registered professional forester and he's worked in Muskoka on Crown land for the past 9 years, after several years of working in urban forestry. He earned a forestry technician diploma from Algonquin College in Pembroke, and has had the good fortune of beginning his forestry career as a technician at the Petawawa Research Forest, where he was conducting silviculture survey work, as well in northern British Columbia. Javier then completed a forestry degree from the University of British Columbia and has been with Westwind Forestry since 2017. Now, welcome, Javier, and I'll just give you the opportunity there to share your slides.
So thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Javier, and I am a forester at Westwind. My presentation today is going to be about how we do silviculture in Muskoka. Um, so first off, let me just talk about what is silviculture. Silviculture comes from two key words, the silvi, which means the forest itself, and the culture is in the growing of that forest. So it's the silviculture is the practice of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and the quality of the forest to meet a diverse number of needs and values. Um, and the nice way of saying it is silviculture is both a science and an art as far as growing and tending forests. And this depends on a core understanding of the silvics, which is the biology of individual tree species and how that individual tree species relates to its environment. Well, before I go further with silviculture, I should talk about Westwind and what we do. So we are a community-based forest management company. Um, our board of directors is comprised of representatives from a whole host of sectors across the community in both Parry Sound and Muskoka districts, as well as Indigenous participation. We're a not-for-profit. The profits generated by the forest are turned back to the forest estate. So that's an interesting component to our company. And we're also an FSC certified organization recognized as a well-managed forest. So where are we? We are in Muskoka, certainly. We're in Parry Sound as well. You can see on the map here in the dark green is what our forest management area is, and it's called the French Severn Forest because the top borders the French River, the south borders the Severn River, and we have Georgian Bay on the west and Algonquin Park on the right. We have over 20 overlapping license agreements with independent operators and mills. So there's lots of people working in the forest that we work with directly. We manage over 1.3 million hectares of forest. Sorry, pardon me. Our area is 1.3 million. We have 570,000 hectares of managed crown land, 375,000 hectares of managed productive forest. There are 130,000 hectares of provincial parks and conservation reserve areas. And because of where we are in central Ontario and what's known as the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest region, 90% of the area that we harvest uses partial cutting systems. So the silviculture that we'll talk about of the selection and shelter with systems. So silviculture is an important part of what we do, but it's not all that we do. We actually do a whole host of things. We identify and protect values through areas of concerns. We oversee tree marking, the application of tree marking, and auditing that tree marking in order to protect those values, to apply the silviculture to initiate the harvest. And then as far as harvesting, we do the oversight and compliance of harvesting of the forest to make sure that all of the regulated and management requirements are being made, and then also monitoring in the sense that we monitor the forest, we monitor the growth of the forest, the trajectory of individual forest stands, and how our forest is progressing over time. So silviculture in Muskoka on Crown land falls under our forest is made done within our forest management plan. And a forest management plan is a 10-year plan. So we make a plan for um, 10 years of harvest operations and 10 years of silviculture. The current plan we're in is from 2019 to 2029, and it these plans are not anything to laugh at. They are a major undertaking, over 2.5 years to develop. It's equivalent to an official plan, for example, for a district or municipality. It's that level of investment and work that goes into it. So just to get a sense of the level of work that goes into a forest management plan, these are all the people that are directly involved with the current plan, from planning team members to advisors to committee members to reviewers. Um, a whole host of people, both forestry staff from Westwind, the MNR, indigenous communities, and stakeholders from all facets of the Parry Sound Muskoka area. That forest management plan isn't follows strict regulations. It follows legislation in Ontario. So we have the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, which ensures that all forest values are considered during planning and operations. That act directs the development of the Forest Management Planning Manual, and that manual is how we develop our forest management plan. That manual is supplemented with a number of guides that provide more specific direction for a whole host of values. So, what I'm trying to illustrate here is how extensive forestry is. And we're going to specifically talk about silviculture, but it really does go into a whole host of factors. And when it comes to developing that forest management plan, we use computer modeling. We look at a whole host of factors. Silviculture is just one of them in order to develop a forest management plan that we can um, not only use for the 10 years of the plan, but that projects what that forest condition across the million hectares that we have, how that forest will change and adapt and develop over the next 150 years. So it's a very large time frame that we work in when we talk about forestry. And specifically with silviculture, we have specific directions within the forest management plan. These are called the silviculture ground rules. And what the silviculture ground rules are mandatory site-specific, forest unit-specific guidelines that dictate how the authorized evidence-based methods of harvesting the forest, of renewing the forest, and of tending the forest so that we can achieve our objectives from our forest management plan. So they establish standards, amongst other things, are regeneration standards, stocking standards, so how much forest is retained and how much forest is going to be growing, species composition, so what types of species of trees, and in some cases we also indicate the desired forest state for the forest. Here's an example of what a silviculture ground rule looks like. It's obviously a very technical document, but just to highlight that we take this very seriously, and this specifically is what we're going to be talking about later on. This is what silviculture looks like when you put it into a forest management plan for hardwood selection, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. But before we do that, since I am talking about a whole host of factors associated with silviculture because silviculture doesn't work in a vacuum. I just want to take a step back and talk about forest ecosystem dynamics, and that is just how forests change over time. Because silviculture, we're impacting the forest, we're making management decisions on harvesting trees, tending trees, potentially planting trees, and we want to make sure that we are managing that forest in a way that is receptive to what's actually happening in the environment if we weren't there, for example. So it's important to note that forests are not static. There's competition between trees all the time. The death of individual trees actually gives us healthy forests, and it's that change over time that enables this dynamic. A lot of people think that based on the graph that I show you here, where you have A, B, C, D, A, you have stand initiation, which is a young forest. B, on the top right, you have stem exclusion, where trees start to compete with each other, and then transition to C, canopy transition, where you have maybe more shade tolerant species growing up underneath, and then D, gap dynamics, where you have more diversity within the forest, and it is understandable to think that this progresses linearly. However, ecosystems, the environment, far more dynamic and far more complicated than we can draw on a piece of paper. And so just to complicate things a little bit more before we simplify things again, this diagram shows you how complicated forest ecosystems can be. It's a schematic that shows you that forests don't progress linearly over time. They change based on a number of factors. The most evident would be any sort of disturbance, whether it's harvesting, fire, wind, or disease. And so, what this schematic shows you is that um, as a forest moves along this cycle, it goes through a period of growth. The bottom left corner R, where things are just growing really well. It matures at the top right in K, and then there tends to be some sort of collapse of some degree in the bottom right. So in the case of Muskoka, you're more likely to see disease or wind events causing that collapse at a smaller scale. If you're out in the boreal forest, you may very well see forest fires causing that kind of collapse at a much larger scale. And then that collapse allows for reorganization of that ecosystem and brings the loop back together to growth. So, just another way of thinking about how forests change over time. And in silviculture, we're trying to emulate this change caused primarily by natural disturbances, and we emulate it with our harvesting systems. Silviculture works to change probabilities in favor of the forest type and the condition which has the greatest value to us. So with our forest management plan, we apply the ecological, cultural, and economic values that we have on the forest. And silviculture works to meet those values and meet those objectives, both in the short, medium, and long term. And to do this, we use evidence-based scientific direction data for that specific forest tract that's collected and which is prescribed um, through by a registered professional forester in order to make that silviculture determination. So silviculture can be best thought of in three systems, and these three systems do meld uh, between each other, but it's easiest to understand them as three distinct systems that we utilize in Muskoka, in which we have specific directions for. So these three are the clear cut, the shelterwood, and the selection systems for silviculture. So a clear cut system is applied to a forest when you have a specific type of forest. So it has to be an even aged, in the case of Muskoka, it would need to be an even-aged, shade-intolerant tree species. Um, if you were in the boreal forest, you might have jack pine forests. Those are also even-aged, shade-intolerant species. Um, Here, you're dealing with white birch, for example, um, poplar, those types of species. And so, not a very common system to be applied. In Muskoka, we don't have many stands that are even-aged with shade-intolerant species. Another system that's applied in Muskoka is the uniform shelterwood. So these are even-aged shade-tolerant tree species that we harvest um, through a series of cuts in order to create the light conditions and the growth conditions to regenerate that forest, but having every section of that growth be of the same age. So that can be done here, and it really depends on the type of forest history, the forest history for that site, whether we apply the shelterwood system. Finally, the single tree selection system. This is applied to uneven age shade-tolerant tree species, and it's the predominant silviculture system used in Muskoka. And we'll go into a little more detail than just breezing over the last two with this one because this will be our example. So we have a mature tolerant hardwood forest. Usually it's a sugar maple, beech, oak dominated forest, and we cut it progressively through different cycles in order to maintain that forest condition and maintain the uneven age forest condition. So, as compared to the previous slide, where you had four cuts um, spread out over large periods of times, which if you look to the right, you have a prep cut at the bottom, a seed cut, the bottom left, first removal, and then a final removal cut. You have these cuts that are actually spaced out over a large period of time. the cycle is much shorter in time with a single tree selection system, because we're not expecting the new regeneration to all be the same age. We want to facilitate that multiple ages of the stems within that forest. So another way to look at single tree selection with this diagram is um, an initial harvest entry. So we have here an image of an aerial view of an individual tree selection harvest in a tolerant hardwood stand, resulting in around 70% cover that's retained. And it's perpetually all age stands. So there is a harvest being undertaken. We have a number of species. We have some hemlock, we have some yellow birch, some sugar maples, some beech, some ash, some basswood, some oak, and we're harvesting about a third of the trees in order to retain both the species, all the different species, but also the different age classes for those species. So retain the younger trees, individual trees, the older individual trees, the smaller and the larger as well. Um, and this next photo shows the regrowth approximately 25 years after that first harvest, um, and the cutting associated with that next entry. So there isn't much difference between those two photos because we are removing a relatively small amount of trees from that stand, but we are returning to that forest stand every 20 to 25 years, and conducting that harvest again. So new trees are growing or being released that are already young and established there, and at a very short interval, as opposed to in a shelterwood system, you'd be looking at 40, 50 years, for example. So we apply these silvicultural concepts and ideas through what are known as forest operations prescriptions. And these prescriptions are developed and approved by a registered professional forester. As you can see, I put a little arrow to my stamp there at the bottom right. The Where the Ontario Professional Foresters Association is a college, with legislation to um, that dictates that forest management prescriptions, forest operations prescriptions are to be signed off by foresters on Crown land. And what these prescriptions do is they provide forest stand analysis, so the forest compartments within a harvest block, an analysis of what those forests look like today, the silviculture objectives for that forest and those different compartments, the tree marking direction, because we use tree marking in order to implement our harvesting, our silviculture objectives through our harvesting. And then it also includes any harvesting instructions um, that are specific to that block. So the first thing that is undertaken there is the forest stand analysis. And to do that analysis, we use a number of resources, both at the desk and in the field. So the first one is what's known as the Forest Resource Inventory. These are digital aerial photos that are interpreted and have field surveys completed to validate that information. And this provides us with a whole host of information. This FRI information is giving us depletion history. When was the last time that forest was harvested? It's giving us species composition of the canopy. So the trees in the dominant trees in the stand, what percentage of them are for each different species. It's giving us the site class, so what quality of soils and sites we have for that forest, um, the heights, the average height for those individual trees. Lots of very valuable information right off the bat from the forest resource inventory. We also have, in the last few years, we've had another method of remote imagery, which is LiDAR. LiDAR is light detection and ranging, and it's a sophisticated set of lasers that are augment our forest resource inventory. So the Forest Resource Inventory uses planes as well to take um, photographs of the forest from above that are interpreted. LiDAR does the same thing, but with a laser. And what the MNR has used in Muskoka and across the province for working forests is what's known as single photon LiDAR. Single photon LiDAR generates a high density 3D data for forest inventory. So this laser shoots from the plane down to the ground, hits something, comes back, and is registered the distance that it took. Others hit different points on the ground, and they also register and gives you this map of that information that it's capturing. And what's really special about the LiDAR that the MNR has applied is that it is a high density. So for every square meter, there are over 25 points or more that are being shot at the ground by the laser. So that's an incredible level of detail across the forest that we have available to us. This data is really valuable for developing um, uh, models for tree density, for tree heights, and for terrain aspects. So incredibly valuable new resource that we've had in the last few years. Um, a profile view of what this looks like, which is really for presentation purposes, um, and really to kind of show you what that LiDAR point cloud represents. So this image shows you a fire tower in the center. There's a chain link fence and trees of varying heights. The colors are arbitrary, but it really shows how the the laser hits the ground. That's the dark blue. It hits the top of the fire tower. That's the red. It hits the canopy of the trees at different heights. So yellows and greens and blues. It hits the chain link fence because it is such a high density cloud of points that are being captured across the profile. Um, so you can create images like this, which are really nice for presentations, um, and this one as well, showing you the profile of forest and terrain. And these metrics are extremely helpful. They augment our forest resource inventory. They augment the field work that we do, and they provide really valuable detail. And funny enough, even those are very attractive photos to show, this map here is that LiDAR point cloud in a very practical sense as far as silviculture and developing silviculture prescriptions. That LiDAR point cloud, the points are augmented into 20 meter by 20 meter squares, so and creates this raster map. And the red dots or the red squares are high density of volume, for example, and the green is low density, and yellows are slightly higher density of trees density, and the orange is even higher. So maps like this are actually what are extremely helpful for myself when I'm developing these prescriptions. So they augment what we see through the FRI. Another method of forest analysis that we do um, is the data collection on the ground. Um, Measuring the diameter of trees, even though the LiDAR, for example, provides is an excellent resource for diameters, this gives us a very detailed and accurate information for a forest stand on the ground that we're assessing. And then, as you can see on the right, there's different requirements for how you measure that diameter based on the leaning, if the tree's leaning, or if it's forked, or if it's got a burl or anything like that. The diameter of the tree is measured at breast height, which is 1.37 meters above the ground. As well as the diameter of trees we collect on the ground through plots is the quality of the trees. And this is described as acceptable growing stock and unacceptable growing stock. The idea being acceptable growing stock are trees that we can expect to retain and grow their value over the next cutting cycle. So with respect to the silviculture of Muskoka, primarily selection, for example, we're expecting that tree to increase in value over the next 20 to 25 years. Unacceptable growing stock are trees that we don't expect that to be the case. And this actually breaks down to be quite technical. So I'm keeping it very, very simple here. Um, so if you look at the object tree in the green triangle, AGS is the acceptable growing stock. On the left, you have an image of a fairly large 58 centimeter diameter sugar maple tree that's quite vigorous, quite healthy. And on the right is an unacceptable growing stock tree, a tree with very poor vigor, also almost as large, 42 centimeters in diameter. But just from the bark alone, one a forester or forestry technician can see that we have low vigor. And when you look at other factors, you might see something like coal fungus at the base of that tree, and that'll clearly dictate that you've got an unacceptable growing stock tree, for example. So this idea of tree quality, of tree health, it has a number of biotic and abiotic factors that influence it, and some things like a fungus uh, are very easy to classify as unacceptable growing stock, but there can be variations or gradients of quality within trees, and so that's information. This is some of the key information that things like the FRI and LiDAR simply don't provide. The quality of individual trees in a plot, and then the quality of that forest at the stand level. This is information that we still collect and need to collect through on-the-ground plots because this information just isn't possible through remote imagery. So, as an example, when you're in the field, you're looking at a tree, you look at and you're at your plot, you look at the base of the tree and you look for poor vigor. You look for any signs of those funguses or any scarring, for example. You look at the bole of the tree. You look for any scars, like there in the middle. You look for any abnormalities to suggest you don't have an acceptable growing stock tree. You look at the crown as well, the health of the health of the crown, the fine branches, um, the junctions. You assess a tree within the plot. You assess the tree fully the full stem from bottom to top, as well as checking the diameter. And the reason why that tree is in the plot is through the other method of data collection, which is called a variable radius plot. So how do we determine whether a tree is in our plot or not? We use this fancy piece of glass on the bottom right of the photo here, which is a two basal area factor metric prism. So it's a wedge of glass, which has a specific gradient to it. And what that does is when you lift it up and stare at a tree through it, it will distort the stem of the tree. And as you can see on the top right, if it distorts the tree and the stem that is visible through the glass is outside of the main stem of the tree, that tree is considered out of the plot and it's not in the plot, as in you don't assess it. If the stem is retained within within the tree, then that's considered a tree that you count. It's in. And if it's borderline, as it's just on the edge, well, then you have to make an assessment. And generally, it's every other tree that falls under this condition is considered in. And how that compares between a fixed radius plot in the image B in the bottom left, which has a plot center and maybe a set distance from that plot center, you would assess every tree in there. Well, that would be in many cases extremely difficult or tedious and probably not as practical or valuable information as these variable radius plots. So diagram C, variable radius that I'm pointing at here, you have the plot center, and depending on how far away from the plot center the tree is and how large it is in the plot or not in the plot. So a very large tree further away from the plot center would be would be captured by the prism, whereas a small tree would have to be fairly close to the plot center to be captured by the prism. And this is really practical because this is how we can assess make a very analytical assessment of the data presented to us in the field. So just to show what that looks like on the ground is there here you have my two basal area factor prism. This tree is around 30 centimeters in diameter, and it's close enough. It's well close enough that most of the tree is actually still within the stem as far as the tree that's inside the glass. Slightly smaller tree, but still close enough that the stem that's been displaced is still within the main stem of the tree. So that's also a tree we count in the plot. Here we have an example of a small tree, what's known as a polewood sized tree, and it is just on the edge. So that's a borderline tree, which is because of where the plot center is and how far it is, it's just on the edge of the plot. And so every second one of these situations, I would assess that tree. And here's an example of a tree that's outside of the plot. You can see how pretty easy to see at the base of the tree and at the top as well, how the stem that's displaced by the prism places the tree well outside of the main stem. And so that's a tree that's just too small and too far away to be within the plot itself. So all this data gets collected through an app that we use on an iPad. So on the image on the left, you have plot data collection. So it's a very efficient and very practical way of collecting this information. Used to be a tally board with a piece of paper and a pencil. Now we're using iPads and specific software for it. And what's great about this as well is that instantaneously, once that data is collected, we can create stand level data that provides us with information about the basal area that's being collected with that prism, the quality of the trees, which is that AGS, UGS of the trees for all the different plots amalgamated together. So as an example, we'll work through this through a selection block, a selection silviculture area in Muskoka. So here's a map of our management unit, the French Severn Forest. That little yellow square at the bottom right is where this block is located, just by a real lake, just near Baysville. So right away, this is what a forest resource inventory map looks like for us. We categorize the different forest stands by color based on the type of forest condition that is there currently, based on the forest resource inventory, and that on the ground data collection helps to validate this FRI information. And the reason I chose this one is because we can establish a silviculture objective for this block, which is in this case sugar maple. Sugar maple is a predominant species within Muskoka, and it's a predominant forest type that we manage. So that's what's in the FRI. That's what we're going to be working towards with our management of this forest through the silviculture, through the harvest. Um, and so with sugar maple as the silviculture objectives, some key direction from our silviculture guides are that we apply tree marking principles. So tree markers undertake extensive training in order to apply these principles on the ground. When we're identifying sugar maple as the silviculture objectives, we want to make sure that the site that we're selecting to manage for sugar maple are not dry, shallow, and saturated sites. Um, we want to maintain overhead shade during early regeneration phase, so right after that harvest, to provide a competitive edge over less tolerant competition, which is why we'll be using the selection system to to retain a lot of that canopy in the forest. Um, and the things that we want to caution when we're managing for sugar maple is making sure we don't create excessively large openings, which can cause epicormic branches and crown dagback. So epicormic branches being branches that are induced by stress on the residual trees, and dieback of the canopy of the crowns of the trees that are being retained for the future. Maple regeneration can be very aggressive and will likely require tending if other species are desired on the same site. So, um, fortunately, we begin with a diverse forest in most cases, um, and as well, since maple is our objective, having that aggressive regeneration of maple is actually also a very good thing. So from the silviculture guides that we have, um, it highlights that for sugar maple as a target species, it can actually be um, it can have a number of silviculture systems and harvest methods applied to it. But our forest management plan and our silvicultural ground rules um, for sugar maple and for selection highlight that what we can use within our forest management plan for sugar maple are uniform shelterwood, our selection, single tree selection, group selection. So these are different systems, silviculture systems that we can use for sugar maple. Um, and while sugar maple can grow it in through these other means, such as clear cuts, such as other types of shelter woods, um, because of the types of forests we have specifically here in Muskoka, because of the decisions from the forest management plan for meeting our objectives, um, these are the direction that we have available to us. So if we work through how we apply the silviculture on the ground, we begin first at the desk looking at maps, assessing the site through our remote imagery options that are available to us. So here we have the forest resource inventory map with none of that information added to it, but um, we begin with this map to highlight the block areas and which are the area in color here. This also highlights reserves and protected areas that we need to be cognizant of as we apply our silviculture. We also look at remote imagery of the actual canopy of the trees. This is extremely valuable because we can see differences in the canopy. We can see differences in the shades of green, in the structure of the crowns of the trees, and being aware of what that means, we can not only identify species of trees this way, we can also find groupings and areas that would be managed differently from other areas. Overlaying those two, we can get even more detail for developing our silviculture prescriptions. We can also use what's known as a digital elevation model, which strips away the forest entirely and shows you the contours of the ground. This is really handy for identifying where roads might be located, either previous roads or new roads. This is also how we can identify where streams might be located as well that might not be in the maps. We use also the LiDAR information to develop these canopy heights. So this map is shades of gray showing light is very tall and then dark is very light, or sorry, very short trees or terrain. So another way of developing even more information. And finally, like I said before, one of the most practical applications of the LiDAR is this, which shows you the basal area on a 20 meter by 20 meter raster map. So the information that I collect on the ground, this is showing it across the forest, but not at individual plots at a 20 meter by 20 meter radius. So it does amalgamate information to a certain extent, and so it's very valuable, but has its limitations as well. So some of the key things that I draw from this map are those dark red areas. They are either very dense polewood or small stem material, trees, for example, or it could be dense hemlock patches or very large and dense sugar maple areas as well. Um, so that's just one example. And those light green areas are generally either openings that exist in the forest or areas with no large trees in them, for example. So that data collected, I would go into the field, collect that data, um, collect the use my prism to do my basal area swing, collect basal area, um, collect the diameters of the trees, assess the quality of each individual tree within the plot as well, and then take all that information together, develop a report, and it comes out in this very, very nice report that we have created by our software. Some of the some of the details of that report is that basal area, and we have targets that we strive for. What this graph shows you is the ideal targets for how much basal area. So each tree that you hit with the prism in your plot, how much of that in the different size classes. So we want to get 6 meters squared per hectare in the poles, which is a 10 to 24 centimeter tree, and so on and so forth for the different size classes, so that we have that variation in size classes across the stand. And this is what actual versus ideal. So the ideal is to have a value of 6 for poles, so small trees, a value of 6, 5, and 3 for saw log trees, so those larger trees, and a value of 20 for the whole stand together. And the actual is that we had 26 for the whole. We had less than 6 with 3.8 for the poles, which is the smaller trees, and 6.8 instead of 6, 7.8 instead of 5, and 8 instead of 3. So in those saw logs trees, so those are trees that are 26 centimeters in diameter and above. We actually have more trees than the ideal, which makes sense because the ideal is for a forest condition that's growing. Um, and we're looking to harvest that tree. So that shows us that that forest is ready for harvest because there is greater amount of trees, greater amount of density of trees than the ideal. This graph shows you the ideal in that pink line, which is called the reverse J curve. It increases as you increase on the x-axis the diameter of the tree, you have fewer trees. So it kind of makes sense when you can have like lots of small trees in an area, but you can't fit lots of big trees in the same amount of area. You can only fit so many big trees. Um, so in an individual stand, you'll have lots of small trees and then progressively less and less of trees as they get bigger. The pre-harvest condition, which is what we're looking at in the survey with the data collection, generally doesn't, the natural environment doesn't generally follow this beautiful curve, but there are similarities to it. So that yellow line shows how it does kind of work. It can be worked towards that ideal. The orange line. And so what the harvest will do is the harvest will remove individual trees from those different sizes and so that the stand works towards the ideal. And the reason we do this is because we want to reach the ideal in order to have that forest grow and be able to return back to the ideal and create that sustainability in the harvest of that forest. Additionally, interestingly, beech bark disease is assessed through this as well, and as you can see, almost 100% of all the beech assessed did have beech bark disease. Something I'll talk about in a minute. We have a flow chart we can utilize as well to make that determination of how we're going to be managing this forest silviculturally. And you can work through the flow chart. Will the site support good sugar maple quality? Yes. The future age structure of that stand will be uneven in the sense that you have trees of various sizes and of various ages. Will the overstory component of that forest continue to be hardwood, so sugar maple, for example? In this case, yes. Will the basal area of acceptable growing stock, so that assessment of quality, will it be higher than 9, which is meters squared per hectare? In this case, yes. And then as we work down that flow chart, is the total basal area of that forest greater than 24? It was. Is the majority of this basal area in a single size class? No, it's not all one age trees. They're all over the place. are there mid-tolerants, such as yellow birch or black cherry, which would need more space, which would change our silviculture prescription from selection, for example, to shelterwood? No. And then that flow chart suggests single tree selection. So this is one way of realizing that we are on the right track. The FRI suggested selection, our mapping shows it as selection, our data collection and assessment and also showed it as selection as well. So this is how we can derive that prescription for that specific area. So we can develop this forest prescription, undertake the tree marking, undertake the harvest, and what we end up with is a forest that began, such as this, a pre-harvest tolerant hardwood forest. After that partial harvest through the selection system, 25 years later, you have natural regeneration of those shade tolerant species, such as sugar maple. And from a basal area perspective, we've harvested that forest, we've let it grow for 20 years or so. And so that basal area, that volume of wood is growing over that 20 years. We cut it with these metrics to try to reach that ideal curve, and we ensure a sustainability of that harvest over multiple cycles. So this graph shows you that sustainability of harvest done over a 60-year period with 3 to 4 cutting cycles within that. And then a final map showing that harvest area, that area now showing as selection and how we depict that on our maps once it's been harvested. So that's the good news. That's how we do silviculture in selection specifically. Um, a lot of detail, a lot of information, and in fact, I kept a lot of detail and a lot of information out of the presentation. It is a very detailed process. But now some bad news, which is beech bark disease, as most of you are probably aware, something that has been affecting Muskoka for, well, probably almost 2 decades now. It's been around for quite a long time, but it's really taken off since around 2010 or so. It's been having a significant impact. What beech bark disease is um, an association between a scale insect, the beech scale, and a fungus. They affect beech trees specifically. And what that results in is individual beech death, beech snap, and uh, has an impact to that forest ecosystem dynamics. So the disturbance pattern we're trying to emulate with our forest management, with our silviculture, is being impacted by beech bark disease at a very fast rate. And beech bark disease can alter the future forest condition. So beech is a very shade tolerant species, and beech thickets that are created by the death of those mature beech can outcompete other species such as sugar maple and yellow birch. So we've had to adapt our silviculture in Muskoka, adapt our silviculture in hardwood forests to deal with beech bark disease because it's not something that's happening a little bit here or there. It is widespread. And as my survey example showed earlier, all beech, it was about 10% of that forest was beech. And that wasn't a beech forest. It was very sugar maple dominated forest. Um, and 10% of that forest was beech, and all of the beech within that forest that was assessed had beech bark disease, either the scale or both the scale and the fungus spores, or fruiting bodies, I should say. So, what are our options with dealing with beech bark disease? Well, we can do standstill level silviculture direction to significantly reduce or eliminate beech in the forest canopy. We can also control the beech regeneration in the understory in order to promote the associated tree species. The silviculture direction we have currently for beech bark disease, and this is something that Westwind has been developing and has adapted as the situation has progressed and as things have changed over time. We're currently removing all beech without tree marking, so we're not even applying paint on the trees to have the tree harvested. Usually we apply orange to have a tree harvested, for example. And instead, we're putting blue on trees, uh, on beech trees that don't show any signs of the scale or the disease, which is the white fluff and the red fruiting bodies. But in doing so, we're doing this strategically. We're leaving no more than 5 to 10 individual beech trees per hectare, and only in patches of 1 or 2 patches per hectare. So for every 100 meter by 100 meters, at most 1 to 2 patches. This way, we're not leaving scattered beech. Um, and this is being applied to poles as well as saw log sized trees. So the small beech as well as the larger beech. And then additionally, because even with this, with the silviculture direction, we still don't expect these beech to survive. The likelihood of beech surviving beech bark disease once beech bark disease is in an area is very, very small. Um, and so these beech that are marked blue, instead of not marking, we're marking them blue for retention, so to not harvest because they appear to be free of beech bark disease. We're not counting these in the residual basal area targets. So that J curve, that graph I showed, those numbers we're trying to hit, we're not including beech in that because we need those numbers to continue for the next 25 years to continue in our project long-term projection, and we're just not expecting that those individual trees to still be around, even though they may look healthy today. So how that looks like um, would be if this square is a 1 hectare block, you might have these two little pockets of beech. Unfortunately, the opportunities to have disease-free beech is getting fewer and fewer. Um, and so we're not getting the opportunity to apply this as much as in the past. But it is still possible to find some beech that are not affected by beech bark disease. And if we do, we will put blue paint on them to protect those little small groupings. The other management option we have is beech tree regeneration management. Um, some of the options we've tried in the past has been brush saw tending around seedlings to reduce competition to seedlings. So, or brush saw tending of trees of the beech regeneration. And we can also use basal bark herbicide tending to reduce the competition from the beech of the other species. So where there's beech growing with sugar maple in the understory, we can use basal bark treatment. And this is a great shot of what that kind of work has looked like in the recent past that we've done here in Muskoka, where we've applied this herbicide very low, to the specific stem of the beech. And so this is in the middle of the summer. This is not fall, and those gray areas, those trees are those are beech trees that are dead in and around sugar maple, in and around yellow birch. And this is another image of what that looks like in the understory. You have dead and dying beech that has been sprayed directly. Because what we have in the forest floor is you have the beech next to the sugar maple. And what we're hoping to see is we can't get rid of beech. There's no need to get rid of beech, but we want to promote those species like sugar maple, like yellow birch, like oak in that stand as opposed to beech. So that beech component, very quick in presentation on beech bark disease. The reason for that is we are planning a field day to discuss silviculture in Muskoka. With this presentation, you have a primer on how we apply silviculture on Crown land. And with our field day, we'll be discussing beech bark disease in more detail. We'll present some of the work we've done over the years, including the various silviculture techniques we've used to manage the beech bark disease. That field day that we have planned with the Ontario Woodlot Association, tentatively, I believe, is for Thursday, May 28th. And it'll be the location is roughly east of Dorset in Muskoka. And more of it information is going to be available through the Ontario Woodlot Association. Perfect. And with that, that's me. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Um,
Thanks so much, Javier. We have a few questions in the chat, and I'll just invite folks if they have any other questions to pop them in, and I can just read them out to you, Javier.
sure.
So One about invasive species and a little bit of background context. This person said, I have a 21-acre woodlot which has had several years of single tree culling in southern Ontario after approximately 60 years of growth. We noticed that new openings in the canopy are enabling the growth of invasives. How are you dealing with this on larger tracts?
Right. Yeah. It sounds like they're more south than Muskoka, perhaps. Um, Fortunately, um, we're not in a location where invasive species, other than of course beech bark disease, for example, but things like European buckthorn, they're not a concern in Muskoka right now. Um, I think you find that more so in Southern Ontario in smaller woodlots. Um, and yeah, it hasn't been something we've had to deal with. But other regions, even as close as Simcoe County, so the Simcoe County forests, they deal with buckthorn in their understory. And so in much the way we're dealing with beach regeneration, you would be looking at tending and either trying to remove those invasive species or at the very least restrain their growth so that the things that you have growing that are desirable, those can outcompete or are given the chance to grow in the area. And that's kind of what we do with beech. We're not getting rid of beech. Beech will remain a part of Muskoka. It's just its composition will change. And where we are actively managing the forest, then that's where we're trying to uh, hold its growth back and promote the growth of other species so that we can maintain that diverse forest into the future.
Super. Realizing that it's almost 2 o'clock, are you able to take a couple more questions,
Oh,
Javier? I don't want to
yes.
hold you up for too long. Okay, perfect. We have a
No, that's
couple in
fine.
here that I'd like to ask if you have a few minutes.
Sure.
There was a question about logging trails. Are the logging trails permanent in the selection cut system?
Essentially, yes. And there's lots of benefits to that too. So there's the roads. I mean, there's the roads and the skidder trails, for example. And it's really valuable because the cutting cycles are so frequent. We're talking 20, 25 years, or if it's a shelterwood harvest, 40 years. Um, by those old skidder trails regenerate and trees grow up in them, but you come back 25 years later and you can see where the old trails were. And that's actually really valuable because we can reuse those trails. And by reusing the exact same trails, assuming they were done in with some good forest management practices, um, then you are not increasing the impact on the site. So you cut those trees down, the equipment goes down the trail, it compacts the soil, but it compacts it on the same place it compacted it 25 years ago. So the impact you have on the site is limited to that specific trail system, which is really great for the growth of the forest in across the forest stand. Yeah.
Thanks. On that note, there's a question about those trails. So when harvesting, do the machines try to use the same trails as laid by the previous harvesters 20 years earlier? Or do they vary?
Yeah, I mean, ideally they use the same trails. Um, Sometimes they do change, especially if specifically on Crown land, especially if the access to that part of the forest is different than it was last time around, or if the size of the equipment is different. So if it's equipment that was used in the 1980s and it was a small skidder or even maybe even tractors or something, those are going to have a different need than maybe a modern large skidder or a modern feller buncher. That would be the main difference. The equipment being used this time as opposed to the last time.
Super. I don't want to keep you too much longer. Maybe we'll just take two more questions. And if anyone else has to go, this is being recorded, so we'll share with folks who've registered. So just a question about beech. Do beech thickets sucker at the same rate for harvested stems versus trees killed by beech bark disease? They're just wondering if there's any known difference or patterns.
Um, well, so the beech bark disease is uh, at least currently it's already impacted the trees that we're harvesting. But prior to that, um, we would have harvested the trees and there would have been suckering. Um, and that suckering component is I don't think it's different in either case. When you walk through a forest, you quickly realize that beech have been suckering and growing like that through generations, and so you get these almost veins of beech um, in the forest. So it could be a sugar maple beech forest, but either because of harvest or because of trees being blown down by the wind or snow or dying from other reasons, um, the beech die, the beech regrow in around that beech, and so what you're left with is these natural veins of beech population in that hardwood forest.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Javier. Just a final question, more so on timber. Does your stand inventory summary include an estimate of stems per hectare for each size class of pole and saw logs? And then is stem count a value in estimating timber value under the planning and operating regime?
Yeah, so individual stems are assessed in the survey, and then that those individual stems are attributed a basal area. Um, and with this two basal area factor prism, each stem is essentially 2 meters squared per hectare in that basal area. And and so we can use that and the different sizes that basal area is in to make a very good estimate of the type of harvest and the viability of a harvest. And then depending on the operation, a certain amount of basal area is necessary to make that operation viable or not. Obviously, at different scopes and scales, this may differ, but yeah, between knowing how much basal area you're going to harvest from an area and knowing the relative quality of that basal area in the different size classes, we can make a pretty good estimate of that there is a harvest, that how much sawlog is going to be in that harvest, and how much firewood, for example, would be in that harvest. It's still very much an estimate, but you do that time and time again, and then you develop a pretty good idea of what those variables are.
Fair enough. And just with it being such a complicated topic, of course, really appreciate all the detail that you've gone into here today. And also just it feels fairly quite accessible. And also the descriptions that you've gone into different silvicultural systems and showing how it ideally would transition from one stage to the next has been really great to see. I'll let you take a look at the comments, Javier. Lots of appreciation.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
One comment here, thanks for an educational and entertaining Friday afternoon. So greatly appreciated. We've kept you past 2 o'clock for everybody, but really appreciate your time, Javier. And hopefully we'll see some folks out during that field day in May, and the OWA will send around some more information about that, including how you can get registered.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone.